Well, it's planting time in many areas around the country, and one of the biggest concerns that you've got on your farm, if you're going to have a great yield, is what's going on in that seed furrow. We need to talk a little bit about what kind of fertilizer you're going to put in there, about sidewall compaction, all these issues in the seed furrow. So here we are in a field that this might get planted to corn. It might go corn on corn here yet this spring, and we got a couple issues. Let's talk about them.
Okay, let's talk about corn stalks first. Whenever you talk about corn on corn, that seems to be a big concern. Am I going to have some hairpinning? Am I going to be able to get through that corn stalk and move it out of the way? How much dirt am I going to have to move, or soil am I going to have to move if I'm going to get those corn stalks out of the way? In this case, we kind of addressed some of those in the fall. We used a chopping corn head. We did some tillage in this particular field, whole scale tillage across this field. Now, you say, wait a minute, I thought you guys were strip till and reduced tillage. You know what? In most cases we are. This happens to be some real heavy river bottom ground that you kind of need to do a little bit of tillage sometimes down here just to get things to go.
Okay, so the corn stalk is the first thing that presents a problem, and the biggest reason why it does is if you don't properly slice this thing up, and let's say it's sitting in the seed furrow and you come along with your corn planter, what's going to happen is you're going to buckle this thing down and you're going to drop a seed right on top of the corn stalk. Is that seed going to germinate?
Maybe.
That's right. We want to take the maybes out of this whole thing. So what are you going to do when you've got residue that looks something like this? You got to find some way to get that sized up if possible. So we've been out running with a Salford machine with a bunch of coulters out there to try to cut these apart. If we've got little pieces of stalk, usually not a big deal. The planter can work with those. But when you've got these great big pieces, something just like this, it gets much more difficult.
Okay, the other thing is just having a nice, smooth, and even bed. You can't have your planter all over the place, and we're very uneven out here, and we've got some big chunks.
At the moment.
So we need to do some kind of tillage to break up these chunks and kind of level things out. Now, if you're applying herbicide as well, you need to try and keep things level if you want things to be successful. Same with the planter.
But the big thing is every soil is a little bit different. So in other words, you're going to need to manage a sandy soil different than a silt loam soil, different than this particular soil, which has very high magnesium, high clay content. So it's fairly organic soil. You can see it looks pretty black and everything, so you'd think, oh, that looks like good dirt. Well, it's not terrible, but it's certainly not our best. And the biggest reason why it comes back to that magnesium content. There's so much magnesium in this particular soil that the soil binds tightly together. So we end up with some of these big chunks. It's really hard stuff to work with a lot of times. And it also ties up potassium and some other nutrients because the magnesium level is just so high.
Okay, so we installed some drainage tile in this field to try and help allow that magnesium to flush through, but we need some kind of soil amendment on top. Like in this case, we're going to put a bunch of lime on this particular field, trying to get that calcium to displace the magnesium in the soil and flush that out. Now back to the seed furrow, Brian.
Yep.
When we're planting in this heavy, sticky soil, one of the big concerns we have is that we get some sidewall smearing. We're out there and it looks okay on the top.
Well, yeah,
once we get down in the soil,
you pick up some of these clumps, and right underneath the clumps, it's nice and wet down there. So you don't have to go down very far, and we're going to end up with some sidewall smearing if we try to plant this too early. So that is a big concern, and that's why it's kind of nice running across with that Salford machine with all those coulters. It'll get more oxygen in there, maybe dry things out just a little bit for us. So that's nice. But what's the bigger concern to me, Darren, is the nutrient availability, because we talked about the high magnesium. We're not going to have much potassium available here, and maybe not that much phosphorus either. What are we going to do?
We definitely don't get much of a potassium release out of this soil. It comes very slowly. And so what we need to do is put something that's highly available in the furrow so we can get a good start for our seed. What we like to use is a product called Sure K. It's a liquid. We'll mix it with Pro Germinator, which is a highly available phosphorus source, and we'll band it right in that row. You could do it in a 2x2 as well, but we do like to put a little bit in as a pop-up. That way our seed and young seedling has a little bit of fertilizer that we know it's going to get for sure.
Now you can go out there with a 1034-0, but keep in mind that doesn't have potassium. You can use something like 918-9, and that's decent, but both of these products have some amount of salt in there, and that's one of the biggest things that we get concerned about in furrow, is if we have too much salt in that furrow, especially in a drier year, we're going to have major problems with germination. We've also had problems where the corn will come up and literally it will buggy whip. It'll twist all up. It just looks terrible, and 50 bushels goes just like that. And it's all because we had too much salt in the furrow. So what I'm saying is, in some cases, we're going to tell you to use less fertilizer. And I know you might say, whoa, you guys are always telling us to feed the plant good. Yes, we want you to feed the plant well. But if you put too much fertilizer in furrow, you get too much salt in there, all of a sudden you can hurt your yield, and that's the last thing we want you to do with your fertilizer investment.
Okay, well, let's keep talking about those roots a little bit because we really need to protect them against insects. And a lot of times we're putting insecticide, some of it's going in the furrow. A lot of times we'll do a T-band where a little bit goes in furrow and some goes on top of the ground.
A lot of times we're doing that
row.
all the time. Yep. So every corn acre that we're planting, it's got insecticide on it. The refuge acres have a full rate. The VT3 or the Smart Stacks, we're using a 1/3 rate or a half rate.
But we aren't cutting that rate back because we're worried about injury to the roots or salt issues or anything like the fertilizer. That's not an issue at all. We're just trying to get good protection from secondary insects, but also some protection from rootworms.
For as few dollars as we can. And we figure, well, the VT3 and the Smart Stacks has got to do something. And usually it does. So we've had some issues with rootworm resistance. Well, anyway, it's funny. We just had the USDA out sampling one of the neighbors' fields for rootworm resistance. So that's why we're kind of debating about this whole thing. So you might say, oh, Smart Stacks and VT3, why are you using insecticide?
No issue with Smart Stacks at all. It was VT3 corn from a couple different companies. That's a totally different issue, and we'll have to get into that on another show. But back to the seed furrow here. We're talking about putting fertilizer in the furrow. You have to be careful about salt.
Keep the rate low.
Putting insecticide in furrow, keep the rate low because it's expensive. Unless you aren't using a BT trait, then you need to use a full rate to protect your roots from corn rootworm. It doesn't take much of a yield difference to get a good return on investment from that.
And make sure you're trying to do everything you can to avoid that sidewall compaction, because if you get severe sidewall compaction there, it can really limit your root growth. And the last thing we wanted to mention real quick, we've talked about this a lot this spring already, is making sure you have the right planting depth, 1.5 to 2.5 inches on corn. Do it right the first time so you end up with great yield and you don't have any standability issues or germination issues.
And as we mentioned up front, keep that residue out of the furrow too so you don't have some hairpinning of especially corn stalks in the furrow.
Well, seed furrow issues can be a huge problem in the spring, but the other thing that can be a huge problem is our Weed of the Week. We'll tell you how to stop it on your farm coming up next.